Hello and welcome back to Create and Activate. I'm Adam.
And I'm John Butler.
And today we're chatting all about sports sponsorship again with Isaac Kirk, our senior strategist, as well as our new sports business consultant, Amy Howells. So Amy is former global engagement director at Manchester United and recently founded Squad Goals, and will be joining us to work alongside a lot of our new brands and current brands in the sports sponsorship world. So very, very exciting conversation we're about to have, and this is everything you've got to look forward to.
You know, when my first question was, well, how many product do we need to sell with this sponsorship? And I got told we're not getting judged on this. And I was like, well, someone in your business is judging us on that metric.
Sports sponsorship was second only to word of mouth in terms of how much people trust like logo and brand affiliation.
I don't think advertisers realise how much they need to spend to activate their partnership. And this is why sometimes you don't see, partnerships as activated as they should be. Is the 2-to-1 ratio in the States. It's a 1-to-2 ratio here.
The brush that maybe the metaverse and Web3 has been tarnished with a little bit in the wake of, the past 18 months or so is almost because it was trying to run before it could walk.
People gave bits of their body back to get the colour back into the strip. And I thought that is really showing the power of sport right there.
So Amy, it's amazing to have you on the team.
Thank you for having me.
You've joined us as a sports consultant.
Indeed.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey to getting to where you are today?
Well, yeah, why not then? Yes. So, started in the industry probably about 20 years ago now. Very much started in kind of through the line comms, and then migrated my way into kind of fan engagement, which landed me working at Manchester United in global sponsorship for a number of years. And off the back of the experience then, I kind of applied my knowledge of business and fan engagements to create Squad Goals, which is effectively a support kind of network to help young business owners really look at the world of sport through a really kind of frameworked lens rather than just creating fireworks within the landscape. So, yeah.
Young business owner, you'll take that, John.
I will indeed. Indeed.
Youngish.
Middle-aged.
Mentally young.
Yes.
Why are you so passionate about sports sponsorship? What is it that kind of really brings out your passion in it?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, actually, it really comes back to the fan, and fan engagement is something that really I'm very passionate about. I did psychology at university. I've always been really interested in sociology and the way that people kind of connect. Mm-hmm. When you actually see the ability that sport's got to help really unite people, but also to drive kind of social change and purpose, you realise there's actually way more to this landscape than just badge and broadcast, big brands out there kind of like pushing their way through to try to get through some traction. I think when we start with the fan first, that's when it gets really exciting.
Yeah. So Isaac, obviously, welcome back.
That's the sports. Wheel me out again.
Keep you all there.
Yeah. No, it's a pleasure to be here. Always is. Let's talk sport.
So why do you think it's significant? Why do you think it's significant to align the broader marketing objectives to your kind of sports sponsorship strategy, and how does that kind of affect ROI as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's highly important. I think, there's a lot of examples in the sports landscape where really when you're buying isolated rights, you don't really connect back to the main business, but also the way that teams are structured as well. You tend to find, especially when businesses are new to sponsorship, they tend to kind of section out somebody from marketing to make it their responsibility, but actually they tend to sit outside of the main functions. So really, actually, objectives aren't really hit. And you tend to find there's a real lack of ROI in sport because of those reasons. So actually, the opportunity really is there to actually say, well, instead of sponsorship being outside of the fold, let's bring it inside. But also, when you're buying rights, for millions of pounds, you don't end up with a huge amount of rights unless you're spending a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So actually, in isolation, those rights really aren't going to shift the dial unless they come back to something that's bigger and more significant to the business. So actually, it just makes common sense, really, to bring those rights back into the main fold and say, well, actually, how do we harmonise with the main marketing strategy? Of course, sponsorship needs a different approach. However, it shouldn't be completely isolated from the main business in order to drive results.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what you were saying a few episodes ago, isn't it?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, you only have to look at how much advertising we're exposed to all the time. Constantly, like you're barraged with it endlessly. It's a bit different to how it was, I suppose, in the 80s or even the early 90s, whereby you didn't have a computer in your pocket that was constantly sending adverts to you and whatever else it may be. So it's a case of like, to be effective and to, I suppose, be a bit more big thinking, then there needs to be that, you need to align with the business goals fundamentally so you can take that to the next level. Because otherwise you are just effectively using the a very, very poor CPM billboard. It'd be far more cost efficient to throw millions of pounds straight into Facebook as advertising, but that's not what it does. That's not what its purpose is. So understanding the purpose behind the sponsorship is absolutely key to doing that. And it all comes back to that fan engagement. It comes down to the fan. That's why you sponsor teams. That's why you sponsor sports, because you want to tap into that, because it's something bigger than an advert on a screen. You don't have to convince people that are Manchester United fans to be Manchester United fans. It's already done. Mm-hmm. So you need to make sure you're aligning yourself and that you're, I suppose, sharing the same principles and values and going beyond that with your brand, basically. So it's all bigger picture. I think down to your point on rights packages and individual things, it's very much, it has to be more than some of its parts, otherwise it's just ineffective. So yeah.
You wouldn't go into a marketing, you wouldn't go with marketing and not write a strategy, you know what I mean?
No, exactly.
It's like you just wouldn't, to get the most out of it.
When you were club side, could you tell the kind of the difference between those brands who were running alongside the marketing team, and then those brands that kind of, you could tell that the sponsorship team had nothing to do with the marketing team, and you could really see the differences between the two?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to, that clients I was working with, I won't name who they are. When my first question was, well, how many product do we need to sell with this sponsorship? And I got told we're not getting judged on this. And I was like, well, someone in your business is judging us on that metric. Mm-hmm. If you're not aware of that, then that's quite dangerous. And actually, ultimately, it did end with the sponsorship not really performing from that side of, opinion. I mean, we did some great work. We did a lot of CSR, and obviously we all felt very good about it. Mm-hmm. When it came to actually core business objectives, we didn't really shift the dial in that respect at all. So I think from club side, it's it's very easy to just go along with the pattern of what the client's telling you. But you've got to interrogate these things all the time, because actually ultimately you're going to have to go through a renewal process, which is kind of unnecessary if you're getting the objective right up front. Because it should be a very easy conversation if it's working from an R or from any business objective, whether it's awareness, whether it's shifting product. As long as you're clear, as you were saying before, from the moment you have the conversations with sales about what you want to achieve. But we do know, unfortunately, that sales teams don't work like that alongside activation teams. Mm-hmm. They're selling a matrix of rights, which is, on a spreadsheet that doesn't necessarily all match up to an objective. It's kind of what's inventory is there and available to sell at that given time. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's really important, especially for people client side, to really interrogate what those rights are, what they're trying to achieve. So ultimately, they're not setting themselves up for failure as well, because if they're in the firing line of a sponsorship that's not going right, ultimately they probably aren't able to come back into the marketing team with so much grace. Mm-hmm. Their job is probably on the line at that point.
I think it's really interesting. So obviously we're all advertising professionals. We have a tendency to think about it from one perspective in terms of the advertiser's relationship with a club or with a sport. Whereas obviously even that point of view is the opposite, where it's in the club's best interest as well. It's in the sports, the rights package holder's best interest to make it work as well. So it's so interesting that we often sit here and think that it's all on the advertiser to make sure it works, but actually there's a shared responsibility there to make sure it works full stop for everyone, because it makes you more attractive as a partner, and you've got those case studies. So it's interesting to hear it from a different perspective, because again, we get locked into brand relationship with partner, when actually it's very much two-way.
Definitely, and I think sponsorship teams are getting more sophisticated now. I mean, I was at United 4 or 5 years ago, and I think we were a bit ahead of our time in terms of how the department's being structured out. But now you are seeing that there's way more strategic people within sponsorship teams, rather than just being relationship managers who, their job is to ensure the person's having a good time in hospitality or making sure that the rights are ticked off at the end of the season. Actually, there is a bit more thought going into that, and that's why you're probably seeing a lot more of the people from Formula, from kind of like Premier League now going into Formula One, because they're going through a similar cycle of journey. So, it does come down to the two parties having the most robust teams in place to ensure that there is a level of strategy and creativity that goes alongside it, rather than it just being, let's have a good time, let's tick things off the list.
At the end of the year, you're like, oh, well, we've got 10 more player appearances to get in 2 weeks.
Have you signed shirts we've got left?
Exactly. But it's really interesting from our perspective. Obviously, we've worked with maybe 10, 12 different clubs, and you can absolutely tell the ones that have the long-term relationships versus those that don't, because the ones that have the long-term relationships with their sponsors, they've got great teams who really actually care. It's not as if they're just, as you say, ticking boxes and, oh, you've got a player appearance, right, let's just get it done, which some of the clubs are still like, whereas like the ones that have got that long-term relationship are going above and beyond and trying to make sure that you're getting everything you possibly can out of that relationship, because they know renewal's coming. So as you rightly say, it's in their interest to make sure that they're absolutely getting everything out of it as much as the club.
For me, I'm really interested about, if you're an advertiser, how do you pick the right club? Or how do you pick the right audience? And that's a really interesting side to it too. But I think we forget about, because ultimately it's the supporters that are going to deliver the ROI.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? And I think, you'd like to think that actually with the modern way, it would come down to values and what the club actually stands for. Because especially when you're starting to look at younger audiences and how they actually identify themselves in the wider world, it's no longer just about, the lad and dad culture going to sports, weekly. The younger audiences expect more from their clubs, and this is why the likes of Marcus Rashford in lockdown became so big and responsible within the Gen Z kind of audience, really, because he was doing something that was outside of the box that they actually connected with and cared about. But if you look at the likes of BT, they've got Hope United, which is actually a collective now of footballers that have come together in a very different reason. But it's a very clever one, because actually what they're doing is putting their technology at the heart of a much bigger kind of social issue to help shift the dial and get young people excited about that. So does it always have to be clubs, I guess, is the answer.
I think you mentioned that almost like a new generation of fan coming through. Why or how important do you think Web3 is going to be in kind of digital technology? Yeah,
I think really, really important. I think, experience is way more important for that younger generation than it ever has been. So the digital world, absolutely, this is how they've been brought up. It's never been just an isolated thing. I could talk about collapsing the distance between the real and virtual worlds, and that is ultimately everything they've been experiencing. But then also lockdown has told that generation they want to be out doing stuff and feeling stuff and being part of something bigger than the sum of one. So actually, I think it's going to be massively important. But with that comes the opportunity to kind of open up again, in terms of the metaverse, in terms of like tokenism and stuff like that. So, fashion becomes really important. Music becomes really important. That generation's they're a polymath. They like lots of things. So when they're looking at second and third screening, they're not necessarily looking at football at the same time as watching football. They're looking about, where somebody's bought their clothes from, or what music they're listening to, and really understanding the history and the kind of personality behind that particular player. So I think in terms of having texture and being able to kind of open up in terms of different territories within the digital and phygital landscapes, I think is highly important for that generation.
Really interesting from an emerging marketplace. I know football predominantly had most of the advertising rights and sponsorship spend. Where do you see the fastest growing areas, or is it still football leading the way and moving off?
I think Formula One's going to be quite an interesting landscape, actually, with the digital aspects they're bringing to the cars and the audio experiences and whatnot, but also just because of the talent they're bringing into the teams. As I said, somebody that's worked in football, I can tell you probably about 80% of the people I worked with are now working within Formula One. So actually, I think there's a real emerging, exciting moment happening there. Their collaborations they've done with Netflix, they understand that their audiences are, they're probably competing with Netflix in the first place as an entertainment platform, like all streaming services are, which is why the Super League almost became a bit of a thing a couple of years ago, because, we're losing people's attention in the entertainment landscape, and football and sport is folded into that. So I think the way they've actually looked at how to create entertainment value out of their sport, I think will actually help them lead the way when it comes to innovation within that younger generation, without a doubt.
You've touched on it there around it. They're almost competitors, aren't they, when it comes to the platform? So how do they ensure that they are breaking through and sort of cutting through the noise?
I think it's about having connected deployment plans, right? I think you've got to have, again, it's like recognizing that the sponsorship is the sum of a part. It's not the main thing anymore, and it's coming back to old school ideation, isn't it? If you have your kind of like core idea at the center, sport then becomes part of the deployment, as does Netflix. Anyone can pitch to Netflix for an entertainment deal. You know what I mean? It's like, it just depends on whether people want to watch it or not, whether they're going to pick it up. There's a wonderful thing that's just been, I think it's on 26th of June for the women's game, that's just been announced as well. It's really kind of helped drive the profile of that. So yeah, I think it's actually understanding like old school thinking. Again, it's bringing everything back into the core objectives of the business. Is entertainment and Gen Z important to you? Therefore, you probably need to be thinking about an entertainment strategy anyway, right? Same with influencer. So it just becomes a sum of a part.
Yeah, I think Formula One's really interesting for multiple reasons. But one is that the Netflix deal's been massive to like catapult it, I suppose, back into the mainstream. It's always existed, but like it wasn't particularly interesting to a lot of people, but now it is. And it's because of that entertainment element where it's almost like a character drama now. And that's the part Netflix have focused on with their documentary series. There's very little in that documentary around like technical specifications and like, 2mm floor ride height and all these like really like nuts and bolts pieces that underpin that sport. That's because Netflix know the audience they're trying to capture doesn't care about that. Ultimately though, Formula One is the winner out of it because it's got more eyeballs, it's got it's attracting better talent, and it essentially has a better product to serve. The racing hasn't changed from now to 10 years ago, but the interest in it is improved massively. And it's because of that entertainment angle, which ultimately is going to help sponsorship and then help the storytelling sponsors are able to do, because now these characters they have their own personalities. Lewis Hamilton stands for something more than just being a driver for the Mercedes Formula One team. He has his own principles and morals and values and brings those through, which is attractive to sponsors that know how to use them and that can have that two-way relationship really as well.
It's a perfect example with Lewis Hamilton as well, isn't it? With his sort of partnership with, is it Tommy
Hilfiger, yeah, I think.
Kind of going into that, and it shows that it's very, very different. You know, that whole landscape is very, very different, isn't it, compared to where it might have been even 5 years ago or a few years ago. They're actually getting these partnerships that are meaningful.
Yeah.
How, as well as that one, or if you want to go into more details on that partnership as well, why do you think that? How do you think that's come about, and why do you think that's really important that it continues and continues to evolve?
So again, it's so nebulous, so many moving parts. But as far as I understand it, the Tommy Hilfiger deal is that they are not a sports wear affiliated company typically.
They're not like a technical partner.
No, exactly. They're not a technical partner, no, but the Mercedes team gear now is made by Tommy Hilfiger as a result of a personal brand deal that Lewis Hamilton had with them before. And it's a case of him bringing that element of personality through towards the team, and that essentially now being just de facto just an accepted. Tommy Hilfiger are now a clothing provider in the F1 paddock for the most successful team of the past 10 years. It seems like, it seems counterintuitive that a sort of not quite high fashion, but certainly upmarket fashion brand is now directly affiliated with something that historically has been the stomping ground of Fila and Puma and Reebok and whoever else. And it just goes towards that sort of, that general thinking and long-term strategy around what's most important here. Is it the actual sport? Is it the idea that, someone that buys a Mercedes team jacket isn't then going to go and jump in a go-kart and set a second faster lap time, are they? But it's about the alignment with the people involved with it. And because Lewis Hamilton stands for more than just being a race car driver, it's so much more effective and so much more valuable and so much more interesting for Tommy Hilfiger to get involved in that, because it reflects their company values more so than historically has been the case. Which comes back to that first question, basically. So all that wider strategy piece, it's all about making those partners more involved rather than it just being we've got 100 grand, we'll do a photo shoot with someone.
It comes back to modern luxury with Gen Z as well, right?
Yeah.
Because, luxury brands know they've got a job to do to get young people involved with what they stand for very early on, because, virtual handbags and stuff like that, Gucci and the Gucci, you've got all the collabs that you're seeing with Adidas and Palace and stuff like that. And you're like, well, actually this kind of modern luxury collaboration space is exactly how to get young people excited and involved. I don't think it'll be long before we see Gucci making football boots and stuff like that. There's already articles coming out that this is actually the way that this landscape's going.
Prada
but also
have just done it.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Prada
but then
and
this is
Adidas.
also takes us back to the metaverse, right? Because actually young people can't afford to buy those pieces themselves. They can buy, a skin in a game, or they can buy, a bit of kind of like digital, equity that's kind of related to that luxury brand. But then you're getting that love mark connection for later in life when they've got the money to actually buy the physical deal. So it's it's connecting all those dots really, which I think is really exciting, really really important for that landscape. So yeah.
Are we seeing any of the trends around phygital in sport at the moment? If not, we'll just move on. We'll just take that bit out. It was just quite a big part of our white paper was in phygital. Wasn't
Yeah,
So
it was. I mean, from my point of view, I think the brush that maybe the metaverse and Web3 has been tarnished with a little bit in the wake of the past 18 months or so is almost because it was trying to run before it could walk. The principles that underpinned the rise of the metaverse and the rise of Web3 and the rise of phygital experiences are still as pertinent now as they were 18 months ago when all the hype was there. So to ignore them as it was just a fad is to really cut off your nose to spite your own face, because the principles that make it interesting still exist. Like there's still a need to think that long term and to think about those elements that you simply can't do elsewhere through phygital. Like I think I mentioned in the white paper we wrote, it aligns so well with sport because it's already been doing it for years. If you think about, buying an F1 game and winning a race as Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone, you are replicating an experience that you can't otherwise have. Like, that has already been like essentially a bit of a bridge between those two elements. The idea that you can buy FIFA and score top bins free kicks with David Beckham against Greece. Like, you are recreating things that are happening. You are recreating experiences in a digital environment. It's essentially just the next element of that, and brands inserting themselves into those conversations essentially in a way that feels natural, that feels engaging, and it feels, I suppose, emotive in terms of how it can be done. Again, it's those fundamentals are true, have been true for years, and will continue to be true. It's just how do brands enter that conversation? How do they do it authentically? Because that's what will be the lasting impact of Web3 and digital sport from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I always say we're at Web 2.5 at the moment, right? We're nowhere near Web 3. And I think actually when you look at classic kind of fan engagement tactics, we have been doing it for a while. What you are doing is trying to, only a portion of fans actually come to the stadium on a match day anyway. When you're actually trying to connect audiences from around the world, you've got to be more creative digitally around that. But, with that though, I think one of the biggest challenges is the lack of connected data within the sports landscape. There's not many clubs out there that actually have a data strategy that actually connects all of the dots. So therefore, how can you have a wallet and how can you start talking about Bitcoin or crypto in that space, and actually need that to be operating successfully within the metaverse. There's lots of clubs selling the rights to the front of shirt without those strategies in place. But with that, it opens up massive opportunities for accessibility, for fans that physically can't get to stadiums, but we are creating kind of virtual experiences around it. It opens up this whole new world around, disability and accessibility, which should definitely not be ignored. And it should be something, rather than just being gamification, it's like, how do we allow every fan to enjoy, what other fans can enjoy in this kind of landscape? So actually from a corporate social responsibility point of view, there's massive amount of opportunities within that, which I think actually could be quite wonderful.
Touching on there, representation, and why, that's a bit of an obvious question, but why is it so important?
Yeah, I think it comes back to audiences demanding more. We don't want to just, see ourselves reflected anymore. I think, for me, there is a real lack of, when we start talking about, luckily we're talking about females in sports. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sat here. It's a great thing that that's now happening. But for me, it's much bigger than that. Actually on and off the pitch, there's huge issues with, on the pitch, there's more representation. Off the pitch, not so much. And actually, if we're having people steering the ship that aren't representing, the wider world off the pitch, then we don't really have much chance of really shifting the dial within sport. But we've got a huge amount of the IPC games coming up in Manchester specifically within the swimming. It'd be nice to have conversations more about those things rather than just talking about Gen Z fan of the future, which seems to be some currency that's still kind of out there 5 years later down the line than I thought we'd already spoken about. But for me, I think, to be able to have these big conversations around accessibility, but also, it's not just about physical and D&I. This is about young people from disadvantaged backgrounds getting into sport as well. It's quite a premium place to be, I guess, from an educational standpoint. So it'd be good to kind of see more representation in boardrooms of young people that, actually come from different areas of the UK specifically, I think.
I think it's really interesting because our idea of pure sport is that it is a meritocracy. Like it is a case of, if you're the best at something, then have at it. So it's interesting, and I think there's probably work to be done in terms of mirroring that off the pitch as well. If I'm from a council estate in North Manchester, and I just happen to be a shit hot footballer, I've got every opportunity to make it. That isn't necessarily true in the boardrooms. It isn't necessarily true at the other levels, because there isn't that perceived ability to do it, and that's not right. Basically, if we're celebrating a meritocracy on the pitch or on the playing surface, whatever pitch it may be, then you'd like to think that'd be mirrored off it. So I think sports has the opportunity to be a bastion of that because it already represents it. It just needs to make sure it's doing it and storytelling, and essentially, fulfilling what it's already doing off the field as well as on the field. I think it's an interesting one because, again, it has that element to it that's already there. It's just not being
I come back to my frustrations around the World Cup, really, in terms of, if it wasn't just 24 men, leading FIFA, would we have ever gone to Qatar? What message is that sending young gay footballers now in terms of whether they ever want to come out within the Premier League? I think we pushed ourselves back about 20 years with that conversation, which is really, really sad. Because actually, they thought they wouldn't be able to play in a World Cup if it was in a Middle Eastern country with those kind of morals. It's like, if we had more representation in FIFA, would we have ever gone?
Yeah.
How many women are now involved at FIFA at that level, or is it still?
I don't think there are any, are there?
Really?
Not that I know, but
I have to fact check that, but I don't think there
I'm
are.
sure that I'm sure there are, but I doubt it's doubt it's significant.
Again, Netflix did a wonderful job of exposing that, though, didn't they?
Yeah.
Ahead of the World Cup.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That was a really, really good series.
Dark.
Yeah, like
Timely.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. How do brands kind of get around the scenario of not appearing to wanting to represent for representing sake, and trying to just ensure it doesn't look like a box ticking exercise, but whereas actually they're doing it because it's meaningful, they're doing it for purpose, and they're doing it for a reason.
Yeah.
I know, and it's a difficult balance, isn't it?
Part of me sometimes thinks, does it matter if it does look a bit contrived at the beginning? Because actually they're setting their stall out to tell a slightly different narrative, and I think people are always going to be critical of change and things like that. I think Unilever have obviously done it incredibly well over the past couple of years. But I think, again, it just comes down to connected strategies again, doesn't it, really? And making sure that actually your strategy is consistent and does represent your audience. It's about understanding your people.
Yeah.
Put you on the spot a little bit here, but it doesn't have to be someone you're working with, and probably can't be. Who's a prime example and who's absolutely shining the light of how sports sponsorship should work? If you were to give us one of your top examples.
I mean, I still really like the BT work with Hope United. I think it's incredibly clever. It's got a linear connection to what the product actually is. It's all about, creating better digital citizens out there. They've picked, a good representation of people, of footballers and sports people to be part of that campaign, from disability men and women. So actually, I know it's not necessarily a club sponsorship, but in terms of what they're doing with that and how smart they're being, I think actually they've tapped into a real social problem. They're trying to drive social change. They've got clear representation, and it connects back to their business. And I think, really simple strategy, but really well executed and done well. And I think, and it's got the results to show it as well. So for me, I think they're doing well.
I wonder if they'll continue it now.
They're doing it this year as well.
So they're just going to rebrand it into TNCs and just.
Yeah, I think they're pushing forwards with it. But another one that I think I shared it with you before, didn't I? And is it? Got to look at my notes. No More Red. So this is a campaign that Adidas have done with Arsenal, where they've taken all of the colour out of their kit just for a one-off game. So actually, it's against knife crime in London. And actually, you weren't able to buy the kits, but it was just a big showcase of how they could leverage, the kit as an entity and from a broadcast standpoint to make a clear message.
The numbers, everything.
Yeah,
everything.
all white
Everything's white.
But
one of my favourite campaigns from probably about 10 years ago is My Blood is Red and Black, which is a Vitória one, which is all about, in Brazil, there was a huge amount of gun crime going on, and all of the kits, it was red and black stripes, all of the red was drained out of the kit, and they weren't going to put the red back until people gave their blood. People gave bits of their body back to get the colour back into the strip. And I thought that is really showing the power of sport right there.
100%. I mean, I think ultimately that's what makes it an attractive proposition for sponsors, because the people care so much about the passion is pretty much like I'd ask you to name something else that stirs people as much as sport across the globe, because I doubt there is.
Love Island.
Maybe Love Island. maybe
just you had some for that.
Maybe, yeah. But yeah, I mean, you literally, you can't really replicate what sports is already doing. So yeah, tapping into that is why it's appealing. But beyond just it being appealing, you have to do it right. You have to do it like, if you're going to use that audience, if you're going to tap into that, then have a look at why that exists. Why is it interesting? Why do so many people follow it? What is it that they feel represents them about their club? When you choose a football club, you are, it's not personality trait, but it's not far off, is it? In terms of it's
identity.
Yes, exactly. It's an identity. So if you're playing in that field as a sponsor and advertiser, then you need to make sure you understand that, and that's key to A, it being effective, and B, even signing up to it in the first place. Because because this is means a lot to a lot of people.
Well, the emotional connection to sport is religion, right? The only way you can actually describe brain chemistry this is why digiboards have a level of effect, right? Because when a goal's being scored, it's called a moment of liminality, where you lose yourself for a couple of seconds and more susceptible to commercial messaging. And it's the same as religion, and it's the same as music. It actually physically changes your brain for a couple of seconds. So this is why, we can go on about badge and broadcast not necessarily being the right approach with, a lack of storytelling. But actually, if you wanted to get your badge out there and, having goals scored in front of it is actually the best way for that to penetrate people and for them to know who you are. But, and it is actually a religious state of mind.
I think, what you mentioned there, we talk about, like how to be effective in sports sponsorship. It comes back to completely what are your objectives? Exactly. If you are a brand new brand and you need to get the name out there, then badge and broadcast is an effective means of doing that. Yeah. If you're trying to do a bit more, if you're already established and you're trying to go into the realm of storytelling and association and start to pick out different personality traits or ramp up things to the wider marketing strategy, then there's a conversation as to how are we really going to execute it. It all comes down to objectives, really, I think, and as long as brands understand that, then there is merit to a brand and broadcast approach, but it completely depends on who you are, what you're doing, and what you want to achieve with it. The idea that you can just stick up the digital billboards and that's done. In 99% of cases, that's probably not going to be right.
It might be the beginning of the journey.
Yes, but there is absolutely an isolated case where that probably is the best use.
If that's that vanilla approach, though, to an entire audience. Sometimes, do you think you're better off trying to go for certain demographics? And if you were, how would you best approach that?
This is why I think it's really interesting to make sure you've got blended strategies, right? I think the creator economy offers a huge amount of equity within that space to help target. I've always spoken about how actually using creators alongside sports strategies helps you then open up those new audiences, especially when you are coming across Gen Zs that are interested in, they have values, but also they might be into kind of, other niche kind of topics, but then connected to sport as well. Mm-hmm. So actually making sure you've got a really robust kind of always on creator strategy alongside your sports strategy would help you really kind of nod to those audiences. But again, it's like we were talking about kind of like digiboards. You could say the same about influencer marketing, but you used to call it like teeth and tits instead of badge and broadcast, as a person with the products just going buy this product. But actually when you get into the depths of storytelling, it's all about storytelling, isn't it? So actually having kind of relative, storytelling moments within a wider strategy to help target those audiences is where that's going to be, I think.
I think I'd argue by even selecting a club in the first place, you've made a choice about demographics there. Yeah. Because realistically, certainly in the UK, that what club you support is as much a demographic factor as your age and where you're from. Like in terms of, location, in terms of how that is useful to communicate with people. It's a really valuable bit of information that you've already gleaned from them. Now, obviously, it's different at league and association level, but I'd say that you've already made a demographic choice by affiliating with certain clubs. Now, there are clubs that go a bit more blanket and will have deals with multiple sponsors and multiple sort of clubs within the same league, but it doesn't change that sort of individual approach within the strategy, is that you're trying to appeal to X fan and Y person. So there is absolutely value in that sort of more strategic, targeting of smaller groups. But it all comes down to, again, why that club, why that sponsorship, why that element to make sure that that's communicated in the right way. I think that's why documentary style things are massively popular now in terms of the way they're taken off, as well as just short form vertical video, TikTok, you name it, because of the access it gives you. So obviously now, like I can go on TikTok and suddenly I'm looking at what Douglas Luiz is listening to on the way to training. Like it's such a strange, tiny little moment in time, but suddenly if you've got brand affiliation, exactly.
It's interesting that, though, isn't it? I was reading in your white paper, because obviously the male game, yes, everyone wants to know behind the scenes, but actually everyone wants to see the professionalism of women at the moment within sports. So actually it's kind of, they don't want to see off the pitch, they want to see very much these women are serious athletes, which I thought was a really interesting find that you uncovered with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this in previous sort of previous things, but I think ultimately you have to remember that when we talk about football, there's ultimately not a lot of difference between what happens on a park on a Saturday morning versus what happens at Old Trafford on a Saturday afternoon. The only thing different is the context around it, and that's what you're tapping into. You're not tapping into you're not tapping into the fundamentals of 11 versus 11 kicking around a football, like that's largely irrelevant. The important thing, the interesting thing is what it all stands for and why suddenly the 77,000 people sold out every single week for that particular venue and billions watching around the world. It's the context is what's important. It's not the sport necessarily. It's the people. It's the stories behind it. It's everything else that makes it an attractive proposition. And to miss that, is to miss the wood for the trees. Basically, you know, if you don't tap into that, then you're not going to use your sponsorship effectively. That's what you're tapping into. So I think that's absolutely like the value there. But obviously we're seeing that with women's game now more. I think there's this thing on the overlap the other day with the run up to the final. Jill Scott was one of the representatives for Manchester City, who've obviously had a successful women's team for a long time. And just even the conversations on that are really like interesting and eye-opening as to how they prepare for games, and like her going from 2,000 or 3,000 people at the Academy Stadium to 50,000 at the Etihad for the first derby, and just the process between that. You know, she's as much as a professional footballer as Roy Keane and Gary Neville on the other side of the table, and the shared conversations in that piece of content and the fact that they're all very much on the same page is evidence of that. So yeah, I think ultimately 11 people chasing a sack of air around for 90 minutes, when you put it in those terms, isn't that interesting? What makes it interesting is absolutely everything else, and that's where the value is for advertisers and for fans as well.
As an advertiser, if I was looking to embark for the first time, what would the kind of split of my creative to advertising spend be?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I don't think advertisers realise how much they need to spend to activate their partnership, and this is why sometimes you don't see, you know, partnerships as activated as they should be. It's a 2-to-1 ratio in the States. It's a 1-to-2 ratio here in terms of spend. So yeah, it takes a lot to activate, and it takes a lot of money to activate it. And obviously, I think sometimes when, you know, there's a robust team in-house at the rights holders, they kind of assume that's going to take the role of the agency, and actually it isn't. You need a really good agency to go on that journey with you. And I would even say that you probably need that agency on that journey whilst you're going through the sales process, rather than it just being, let's land these rights and then let's all sit down and figure it out together. It's good to have a plan first, I would say.
But yeah, I work in strategy, and the difference between we're going to negotiate with this club, what should we get, rather than someone coming to us and going, here's what we've got, it is worlds apart. Because ultimately, like, you are letting the tail wag the dog in the second instance. You are, right, how do we make this fit, rather than how do we make this fit to us, rather than the alternative, which is how do we make our strategy fit to this deal, rather than just how do we shoehorn this into our strategy. So it's night and day in terms of what you can do and how effective it can be from that point of view. But yeah, I think activations, I don't want to say it's everything, because it's not, because without the deal you haven't got anything, but the difference between what you and I perceive as good sponsorship is probably more likely to be good activation. You know, you see massive firms like Wanda and whoever else sponsor the World Cup. There's no lasting impact for it on you and I and all of us. And I know I used that example last time, but it's pertinent because that's the biggest sponsorship. That's the biggest sports sponsorship package on the planet is World Cup, you know, premier partner of the World Cup. Because it wasn't activated in a way that you and I perceive good sponsorship to be activated, it's not got the lasting impact of an Adidas or a Rolex in Formula One or whoever else that goes above and beyond, where the rights package and those elements are the starting point, not the end point.
That's really interesting. You touched on a point there. How do you ensure that after that final whistle, your activation keeps on going? What are the best ways?
Well, I think it depends. So in the instance where you're just badge and broadcast, then your only hope is that something major happens whilst you're on screen. That's about it. And you can, I'm sure that, you know, that you can have elements of, you know, strategic photography or whatever else being taken and affiliation. But ultimately, if nothing of note happens whilst your name's present and on screen in that sort of arrangement, then your lasting impact is essentially nothing, really. But to I suppose do it effectively, then again, you need to tap into what it is you're sponsoring. So if it's a World Cup, then it's a moment in time. It's all about typically the culture of the event and the location it's being held in. It's the storylines that have guided it up to the point of it finishing. So obviously Lionel Messi was the big storyline all the way through in Qatar, primarily because it was sort of seen as his last chance, whatever it may be. It's having the context of that to create something a bit more lasting. Again, to put comms out there in a vacuum where none of these storylines exist and there's no reference to any of them or any of the context surrounding it, then why have you sponsored the World Cup? Why have you sponsored something that is already affiliated with the moment in time and a specific set of circumstances and a specific set of storylines? And it's the same for everything. If you're sponsoring a club, then why is it that club? What is it that you can draw out that makes that interesting to fans and non-fans alike? So again, it's all about, to make a lasting impact, it's all about aligning with what you're sponsoring and understanding why you're sponsoring it in the first place, so that you can then almost communicate that to the rest of the world. Because if you can answer that question internally, then you sure as hell can answer it externally with a bit of with a creative team and a good agency. So I think it's all about alignment and authenticity and timing and everything else that goes into it.
And just the basics of just making sure you've got a huge amount of content off the back of everything you're doing, right? And making sure you've got a really robust amplification deployment plan so that you can create a legacy strategy post-event. I think, that kind of takes the word of activation into a very different landscape. You're not just talking about one-off bursts. You're talking about how can we saturate this from all corners to make sure that we've got something drumbeat-led that can carry on until the next thing.
Just to rewind just a little bit onto the investment and the investment into activation. Am I right in saying that you said in America they're spending twice as much activating it, so on their content, etc., as they are on the sponsorship itself?
That's the rule of thumb.
And then, but in the UK, it's the
half.
other way around.
It's half of the cost of the sponsorship.
So in America, effectively, they're spending 4 times more activating than they are
in the
UK. That's crazy, isn't it?
It's huge.
And then those brands in the UK are looking at the ones in America, going, how come they're getting it so right? How are they, why are their sponsorships so good? Because they're spending more money on activating it. There's your answer.
And they've got the budget for it. They've put the budget to one side.
Yeah, I think it's a massive, almost taboo, isn't it? That brands almost don't want to. They go, "Oh, we spent the money on the sponsorship," and they almost don't want to open their eyes to the fact that they haven't got the budget to activate. So it's all right. That's the job's done. We've done the sponsorship now, and I think that's what's really important. Is at the beginning, probably don't do the sponsorship if you haven't got the money to activate it.
100%. Otherwise, it's just a moot point, isn't it? It's completely. But also you've got to have a very agile approach to things, because obviously player appearances happen at the drop of a hat. You're working around active players, right? They're not actors. So, you don't have the scheduling that you would normally require for TV shoots. You've got to really be around their training schedules, and anything can happen. Players can drop out, players, can be replaced. So actually that costs money as well to be able to be agile. And this is the other thing that people don't understand. There aren't as many efficiencies in, trying to plan out for 4 player appearances a year as there could be if you were working with actors or working in, studio settings. So actually there is a degree of flex required for all of those things. Which makes it more expensive. You
only have to look at Manchester United. If you penned a sponsorship deal with them in September of last year, you unexpected 4 Cristiano Ronaldo appearances. He was gone by, ostracised by December, essentially. Yeah. So, like, that ultimately shouldn't be the reason you want to sponsor United if it is for one player, because otherwise just go and get an endorsement deal. Get an endorsement deal. But there is that risk and that, I suppose, that collateral involved. To your point, they're not actors; they're athletes.
Yeah.
So it's crucial that that's, I suppose, a consideration. But again, if you're sponsoring Manchester United and it's only for Cristiano Ronaldo, then you've already gone wrong. Because again, it's not the authenticity, it's not the angle that you're going to get the most out of that deal for, if you're doing it that way around.
This is why I suppose the work we were doing with Chevrolet was so well received, because we had Chevrolet FC, which was a Facebook page that had Premier League status, because we had that many people following it. And our content plan was it was kind of before the days of kind of like influencer, really, but there was a huge amount. We involved fans constantly. We had 2 different content strategies, one which was all about fans and one which was about players. So, actually being able to kind of like harmonize the 2 together and just, think bigger than the rights, and like, how do you create more opportunities for community and for fans to get involved in the strategy as much as the rights that you've got on the ground. And also, if you have got signed shirts, they can be part of a wonderful digital strategy that's all about creators anyway, to help you create kind of moments of amplification. So
the subject that seems to be everywhere at the moment is AI, and everyone's talking about it. And I don't want to delve into it too much, because I'm sure we could probably do a whole other episode just on AI itself. But where do you see, especially on the personalization side that we spoke about earlier, where do you see AI playing a part?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the digital board landscape in terms of being able to regionalize I think that's probably, it's been on the cards for a while. I think that's, would have a huge amount of value because obviously, they're played from stadia level rather than actually digitized. So that would just allow, assets to be broken down, but also to make, more regionalized opportunities more, more kind of commercially viable for younger businesses wanting to get into sponsorship, businesses that can't necessarily afford, the full digi rights for a global deal. I think, it'd be a wonderful opportunity to help kind of collapse down that landscape to make it more accessible. So I think probably digiboards would be on-pitch branding potentially.
I think that's just a natural development as well, isn't it? So United were an absolute trailblazer in terms of regional partners. The idea that they've got a tractor partner in Asia, which is which the idea 25, 30 years ago is absurd. Why would that ever exist? But now suddenly...
They're really popular.
Well, yes, no, of course. But now you've essentially got okay, we can now bring that sponsorship to life in the stadium. So now actually, if I was on the fence maybe about a regional rights package deal, suddenly it's a hell of a lot more attractive to me because I can have essentially the same gravitas as an Adidas or whoever else it may be that's sort of in the stadium on the advertising hoardings. So it works, I suppose, a little bit backwards in terms of you've gone niche and regional and bought into the interest first, and then suddenly you're kind of getting the badge and broadcast bit thrown in rather than it being the other way around and trying to figure out how do we activate this. Yeah, it's almost like working bottom up, which I think is probably a more sensible way of doing it, certainly. And yeah, it brings that perk to it that simply didn't exist before, doesn't exist without that technology. So I think that'd be really interesting, and I think it might shift the landscape a little bit of sports sponsorship, just generally speaking, when it comes to clubs, because again, it's massively different. I think the advertising boards now are already a tool to advertise very much on the broadcast and not to the people in the stadium. You often see them in Chinese text or whatever else it may be, depending on the market that's going to have the most eyeballs on it. So yeah, it just makes more sense that it'll attract more foreign investment. It'll attract potentially more local investment as well, just in terms of how that can be executed. It brings more.
It makes sponsorship a bit more data-led as well, right?
Yeah,
because
100%.
Obviously when you start to think about your TVRs and eyeballs in market, actually it helps you be a bit more sophisticated about where that is. And I think it's only going to be a benefit to the industry having more data to understand how those audiences are reacting.
The best, I know we've talked about F1 a little bit, but the best one I've seen is the F1 model, essentially, whereby they essentially have an AI feed that watches the race at the same time and then essentially gives the series sponsors a report at the end of how much screen time their logo got, where it was, so that they can then figure out, okay, on the track this camera is going to be on the longest, so we'll put boards here. And nice. This element of, they can essentially, by the end of it, say to a Rolex, the race was 2.5 hours long, your logo was on screen for 63% of the time in some capacity, because they essentially just have an AI feed that runs and operates and just clocks all of the different iterances of these logos existing. And again, suddenly that's a much easier conversation when it comes to renewal and in the boardroom, because actually now we know that it's not just an assumption that we'll put a load of logos on this particular corner and we want that particular corner. Now suddenly you've got a percentage of the entire broadcast was X person, and we know that why people watched it, and so on and so forth. So you've essentially taken the benefits of digital marketing and the data it gives you, and then applied it to the physical event that's happening in person, in a way that gives the advertiser massive sort of benefit and value in terms of like actionable insight.
And understanding the cost of the real estate.
Well, exactly.
It probably is twofold, isn't it? Because you know that board is the most seen.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
all of a sudden, that board doesn't cost the same as that board.
Helps the rights holder when it comes to renewal conversations about the value of what they've actually sold in the first place, right? As well, to help them commercialise that either better or more fairly.
Talking about rights and return on investment, return on sponsorship investment. If you're embarking out on a sponsorship journey, or you're already in sponsorship, how would you prove and make sure that you're not the first person or the first line in the marketing budget that's getting switched off with the current global climate?
Yeah, I think this comes full back, to where we started. It comes back to what objective you're trying to hit with that partnership in the first place. You've got to be able to sit down and make sure you've got measurement in place when you start out, because obviously, the rights holder itself will feed back to you over TVRs and, digital impressions and all these kind of different kind of vanity metrics. But actually, what are you trying to get out of it? And then how does that compare to the rest of your marketing results? And I think that's the only way you can do that, really, is making sure that you've got very independent measurements happening away from the rights holder as well. for me.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I failed to remember who the report was by, but sports sponsorship was second only to word of mouth in terms of how much people trust like logo and brand affiliation. Because again, there's a perception that it is, you've got to know your onions essentially to be in that game. There's a reason that it's so trusted. And whilst that's in theory a quite soft metric if it came down to a boardroom sort of a boardroom standoff, the principles behind it are still so valuable that sports sponsorship, if it's integrated as part of the strategy effectively, shouldn't be on the chopping block in the first place, really. And it's obviously up to advertisers and rights holders to make the case, but I think ultimately, if it's gotten to the case where the sponsorship's being questioned, then actually the problems existed before it's got to that point. It shouldn't, if chosen correctly and activated effectively, there's no reason it would be the first thing on the chopping block. I think is almost the point there. And that again comes down to what you do, how you select it, and how you activate it fundamentally. I know it's a bit of a nothing answer, but I think fundamentally it's the truth. All the building blocks for it to be a massively successable pillar are there. And if they're not executed on, then sure, it could be on the chopping block. But realistically,
sometimes that could be a bit short-termism as well, couldn't it? Because there is long-term attribution to seeing brands grow. I think it was in the white paper, wasn't it? Or one of the previous podcasts where we talked about Barclay Card and their affiliation with the Premiership or Barclays.
Yeah, so it was obviously the Barclays Premier League. It's no longer the Barclays Premier League, but they are the chief financial partner. So they did a risk assessment, essentially, like a full brand risk assessment of the costs associated with being a title partner, the costs associated with being a financial partner, and the costs associated with exiting. And it was established that whilst the cost of title sponsorship weren't necessarily worth it to them, the brand risk of getting out was far, far greater. So it was a case of them essentially taking it down a notch, but retaining that affiliation because of the value it's brought to the brand. So it was just an adaptation, really, essentially, of an existing agreement rather than it doesn't work, we're getting out of it. It was deemed far more of a brand risk to not be involved at all than it was because of that long-term affiliation, that long-term association with the Premier League. So, again, the intricacies of it do fail me, but I know fundamentally it was far more of a brand risk to completely leave for the Premier League than it would have been to keep paying, I suppose, the very top package.
Going into the new season, so with football specifically, do you think there's going to be any emerging trends going into 23-24 season? Anything different on the horizon?
Do you mean like a 4-3-3 that we haven't seen before? Or like...
Christmas tree, proper Mike Bassett formation.
Yeah, exactly. 5 in the box. Yeah, crowd the keeper. I don't know. I don't know now. I've derailed myself. So
I think just generally when you're looking at kind of marketing trends, I think the digital world is going to be more progressive again and again and again. And I think that's probably what we'll see more of, is that how people are going to be more kind of creative when it comes to experiential, and how they can collapse those distances between that that kind of like digital world and that physical experience. So I think actually the world of live is having a massive moment again after 3 years of not being present. They are getting budgets which were mainly given to media rather than to live experience, but a live experience has been seen as and deemed as a very important part of strategy going forwards right now. So I think actually people will be finding ways that they can actually be way more kind of like experiential with their rights, I would say.
It's good stuff. Well, thank you both very much for coming in, and been really, really interesting having a chat. And again, welcome to the team, Amy.
Thanks.
Very much looking forward to having you about and us all creating some amazing content for a lot of brands next season and into the future. If you'd like more information on our sports sponsorship offering, or would like to take this conversation outside of the podcast, check us out at trunkbbi.com. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you soon.